After reading a few posts on here, I've decided to add one of the creepier, still unexplained events that's happened to me and a group of friends within the past 5 years. Thinking back on it, I still get this unnerved bad feeling that just sort of lingers. But anyways, here it goes. A group of friends and myself rented a place on the lake just for a fun-filled drunken weekend. We were all in our young to mid-20s, and it was supposed to be just a big party. For the most part, that's what it was. Friday night and Saturday morning, we pretty much went all out, having a blast on water, just doing fun and stupid stuff. Well, naturally, when Saturday afternoon rolled around, we were all so dead from going out, we decided it would just be a night of no drinking. Maybe just a little weed smoking by some of us. Just have a chill, relaxing evening and night. And that's what it was, relaxed. So 9 p.m. comes rolling around, and about 8 of us were inside of the house and 5 outside. The house was a 2-story, with a second-story deck/back porch, and was surrounded by the woods, and then down through the woods, you would hit the lake. I'll mention that we'd already experienced some weird vibes from locals when we first arrived in town. Mostly just backcountry old-timers, that I assumed. We were leering and irritated because we were just a bunch of college-age kids looking to have a good time. But the town and the lake were so large, so it's not like anyone knew where we were staying. Anyways, 3 of my friends were on the back porch upstairs, and my other friend and I were just downstairs outside, just talking on this old little table near the woods. I mean, it was otherwise just a really nice night out. My friends and I were just getting lost in the conversation, and all of a sudden, there's this weird feeling that just encompassed us. Like an unnerving physical experience that came from the woods behind us. It was so strong we both kind of quieted down, and then out of nowhere, this loud chanting abruptly came from the woods. I have no idea how far away it was because of the way the lake is set up, but I'm pretty sure the voices carried up through the forest. It sounded like a cult chanting away, and all the voices were male. I mean, they were loud and perfectly in sync. We were all frozen for about 20 seconds before I couldn't contain myself and darted towards the house with her following behind. I don't know how to explain the feeling that came with that chanting. It was almost evil. Like, just something so powerfully uninviting. I was shaking by the time we got up to the second story and ran out into the balcony with my other 3 friends. One of them being my brother. By the time we got up there, the chanting was gone, and I naturally asked, "Did you guys hear that?" in the most shaky, freaked out voice. They all had heard it, and not but a few seconds later, the chanting began again. So the 5 of us were out there peering into the forest, listening to this chanting that would sometimes sound far away and then sound relatively close. All male voices in the weirdest language, or I don't even know what it was. Sounded like a strange, extreme church. Then following the chanting, a loud bang would sound, like someone hit a huge metal object. And then, the worst part came. A man wailing, like wailing out in some kind of extreme pain wailing. All my hair was up. It was the freakiest experience ever. My brother and I were staring at one another in a mixture of scared excitement and horror. The wailing stopped, and it was back to the chanting, which eventually did die out. I was so freaked out by it I wanted to call the cops, because whoever screamed had definitely been in a lot of pain. That mixed with the weird chanting just made me immediately think that some terrible sacrifice was going on. One of my friends tried to say it had to be some drunk guys just messing around and singing, just being weird. But no way was that sound coming from some drunk guys. They were perfectly in sync. Then the bang, then the wail of pain. All of a sudden that weird tension energy was just gone. Nope. I didn't call the cops, but I wish I would have. Honestly, the forest was so large. Since the lake house was up looking down at the woods and the lake, it could have been anywhere. It definitely wasn't in our close proximity, but it was close enough to hear all of that perfectly. We went inside to get some of the others, but by the time we came back out, the chanting had stopped. Someone wanted to go explore and find where it had been coming from, but obviously that was a very stupid idea. After that, I was so ready to go home. I can't explain the relief of driving away from there the next morning. Even now, it gives me the worst feeling ever. Whatever that was, it felt evil. It felt wrong. I'll never forget that moment. I still can only imagine it being some kind of weird cult stuff. So I've been on Grindr for about 10 years, 5 of which were illegal and not proud of it, and I've had plenty of really weird experiences. This one in particular reminds me of when I was at a party without my car, and my phone was on 10%. But a decently hot Grindr guy said that he could pick me up and we could hang at his place before he drove me home. So of course I jumped on the opportunity. So anyway, we get to his place, and he got me pretty drunk, but never tried to make a move. I assumed he was going to wait and just convince me to stay the night later. Finally, my phone died after like 2 hours, and I didn't even have to say anything before he noticed that it was dead. He stood up and was like, "Well, let's go to the car then." When I asked if he had a charger that I could use, he just said, "No." After we get in the car, he got kind of quiet and a lot less flirty. I spaced out, just enjoying the music and looking out the window. I didn't even notice that he never asked where I lived until I realized we'd been driving for over an hour. Not even towards my town, but into the canyons outside of Salt Lake City. I asked where we were going, and he just said, "Thought we could go for a drive." My drunk ass was like, "Oh, okay." So anyway, to make a long story shorter, he ended up taking us 4 or 5 miles down this dirt road with no signs or houses until it dead-ended into this cabin that had no lights on or cars outside. He parked and turned off the car. That's when the dread started to creep in as I sobered up. I said I drank too much and should probably head home. He didn't even respond. He just sat there, staring at the cabin. And then he was like, "You said you like being kinky. You're pretty submissive, right?" And I was like, sure, but I just meant like normal, rough kind of stuff. Nothing wild." He started sounding a little annoyed, and his sentences seemed to be less carefully worded, like he was just spitting out the bare minimum of each thought. He said something about how some of his favorite people are the ones that can find pleasure in pain. And if someone goes into shock enough times, it'll become like a drug and they crave more. Then he said something else about how pushing a person into the deep end is the fastest way to teach them to swim. At this point, I was definitely scared enough to assert myself and said firmly, "Okay, well, that sounds fun, but it's not going to happen tonight. I just want to go home now. This place is creepy." He sighed and gripped his keys tighter. Then right as I glanced at his phone sitting in the cup holder, right before it occurred for me to grab it, he snatched it up so fast and held it in his left hand, kind of behind his head to make it clear he wasn't going to let me near it. It made this kind of "what?" sound. He gave me this kind of half smile, like a dad would do when they pat your shoulder or something. It was quiet. He kept looking me up and down for a minute or so. He got a little more gruff and said, "Let's go inside. I have these friends you'll really like once you meet them. You'll feel a lot better." He wasn't even trying to sound genuine or comforting like he'd been doing so well earlier that night. Finally, I just lied and spoke up and told him, "I told my roommates and my friend I was meeting up with you before you picked me up. I sent screenshots of your face and some of the conversation. They're going to freak out if I don't charge my phone and reply to them in the next few hours." I tried to not make it sound accusatory, but more like I was just worried about my friends going crazy. But it was clear that he knew what I was implying. At that point, he let out an exasperated, grunty sigh, started up the car and drove away. For some reason, he kept the headlights off all the way back down this dirt road. Driving back, I got nervous about him stalking me and coming after me in the future. So along the drive, I just tried to apologize and tell him I'd be down to hang out another time. Just not tonight. Tonight was no good for me, blah, blah, blah. He didn't say a single word the whole drive back. Didn't ask where I lived. Definitely didn't intend to tell him either. He dropped me off at a McDonald's about 40 miles from my apartment. When I was stepping out of the car, he suddenly leaned over, gave me a hard shove so I almost fell out the rest of the way. He grabbed my backpack off the floor and flung it out his window across the parking lot, and just peeled out with the passenger door still open. He broke my laptop and cracked my phone. I had asked a stranger to use her charger and call an Uber at that point. But I was just so anxious to get home, I didn't give a shit. What's so weird is how, while it was happening, even though I was terrified. I guess I wasn't thinking about exactly what he was planning to do with me. I just knew I needed to get away. So it wasn't until I got home and in the shower that I realized how f***ed up all this was. What might have happened if I'd let him walk me into that cabin. I just remember being so shaken and smacked by the reality of all of it. Almost felt like a panic attack, so I sat down in the shower with my head between my knees and just cried until the water ran cold. Then I got out, woke up my roommate to tell him about it. He kind of calmed me down. So while I do still have a Grindr account, I really just kind of use it as an ego boost now. And I'm very reluctant to meet up with anyone from it now. I just discovered the sub and I have been reading your stories. Some are really quite frightening, but I have a tale from a long time ago that I thought I would share. I think it belongs here and I hope I don't bore you. I am now a 72-year-old man. This happened a long time ago, but I remember it so well. The background was a series of events that placed me in a mountain cabin outside of Frederick, Maryland, circa 1969 or 1970. Just say my life at the time was in disarray. I dropped out of college. My father had died very badly and I was alienated. I needed to get my mind right. The opportunity to move into an isolated cabin, to live in contemplation and solitude was welcome. I had some inheritance money to pay for it. To the best of my memory, I was there 8 to 9 months. No TV, but books and radio. I had a library card, and I can't remember if I had a phone. The story begins when a month into my stay, a female beagle showed up at my door. She was a lost dog, and I took her in. Never could train her to do anything, but I fed her, and she was sweet, if not the brightest dog. A few months in, I began to feel a presence around the isolated cabin. It's hard to describe, but I felt like someone was watching. On many occasions, I thought someone might even be looking in to my cabin window, watching us. The next phase was the shadowing, or following. I knew the folks half a mile down the lane, woods all around, and would sometime visit them at night. Someone, or something, was waiting for me, and followed closely into the woods beside me in the darkness. You could easily hear it, the footsteps in the woods. It would pick up its pace as I did. This not only happened to me, but to my younger brother who visited, and to other friends, and it spooked them big time. At night, it was out there, around the cabin. Here's the funny thing. I was never afraid, never felt threatened. Not at all, at least early on. There was no feeling of malevolence. I spent a good time wandering the vast areas of the woodland around me. There was a state park just up the hill, and the Frederick Municipal Forest went on for mile after mile. The whole of Western Maryland was much more country than it is now. None of the development had set in yet. In our hikes, the dog and we came across evidence of campsites, recent ones in the woods. Traces of fires, old abandoned buildings that had corners that gave shelter and looked slept in. Garbage and food and drink, paper and what have you, perhaps hunters, but much of it did not have the organized feel you would get from experienced hunters. During the last month of my stay, this was when things intensified. Maybe he sensed that I was preparing to leave. In the mornings, I would find small dead animals at the bottom of the front porch steps. The cabin had a small front porch, screened with a light door, and 4 wooden steps to the ground. A spotlight would illuminate the long yard, with woods close by on either side. Dead animals began to appear at the bottom of the steps, many mornings. I remember small birds, then a squirrel, a rabbit, even a weasel one day. Like they were offerings. I had to grab them up before the dog ate them. This went on daily for several weeks. One night, very late, I was awoken to some sound, lay in bed and heard something from the porch. I hopped up and hit the lights, and then I saw that hound dog, who never learned to sit or stay, standing at the front door in a perfect point position. She was shaking with fear. She never barked. I heard the door slam and footsteps down the steps. I hit the spotlight but saw nothing. I went out. He'd been on my porch at my front door, maybe even trying to enter. After that, I stayed in at night more and more. The animal offerings got bigger and bigger. Larger birds, a possum, a woodchuck. It was not funny. The final two gifts were legs from either horses or cows, big and bloody. One was even skinned. The second to the last day, the dog left me. I could hear her in the woods howling on the trail, following a scent. I looked for her in every way that I could. I came up in following weeks, but still to no avail. She left just as she came. I ended up moving back to Maryland suburbs of DC. Got an apartment with a friend, got a job, and moved on with my life. One day, not long after I picked up the Washington Post, there was an article about recent encounters with the Sykesville monster. It described a tall, Yeti-like creature, fur-covered on two legs, that would pick out family or a person and give them quote-unquote attention. I wasn't the only one. That attention described in that article was exactly what had happened to me. Following you at night, looking inside the house, gifts, and so on. I was shocked. If I had turned on that spotlight and seen a Bigfoot or a Yeti, I still might be running to this day. But I think I know who it was. Sykesville, Maryland was the location of the Springfield Hospital Center, a large state psychiatric hospital. It was 20 miles or so east of Frederick. Back then, many folks knew how to live in the woods. They grew up that way, country folks. I think the monster was an escape patient, or just a free schizophrenic who lived outside. This is just like all the homeless you see in cities now, probably off his meds, but somehow functional and lonely. He would pick people or families to adopt. The camps in the woods would have been him. Nothing to do, he would make mischief. I think he liked me, but sensed I was leaving. I can't prove any of this, it's just my theory. My monster was very much of that time and place, and his behavior was what I noticed in nearly every single case. I do not think he could have survived until the 1980s. Deinstitutionalization of mental hospitals threw the mentally ill out into the streets and took away the shelter of hospitals. And unfortunately unprotected, the mentally ill die. My dad grew up on forestry in Queensland, Australia, as the son of a forest ranger. My whole life we spent a lot of time in that forest, camping and driving through parts of the forestry that only rangers would travel, and only occasionally. One place that Dad loved to take us was this little farm in the middle of the forest that was impossible to find if you didn't know the way. Locals knew the place as Spike's Hut. Spike was a local farmer who had lived there for decades up until the 90s, and had a reputation of being abrasive, violent, bigoted, and not concerned with the laws of men. He had a habit of approaching guys in bars who were wearing earrings and tearing them straight out, and there were a few stories about people who displeased him disappearing. Basically, Spike was not a nice guy, and his farm and hut reflected that pretty well. Dad would take us out there every time we visited the forest, and the hut would be more and more dilapidated, but the vibe was always the same. Straight up feeling of being watched, even though Spike was long gone. As I got older, I became more aware of the signs in life in the place when we went to visit. There would be 44-gallon drums full of smashed beer bottles, fire pits with reasonably fresh coals. Someone was definitely out there. God knows why, since the place was literally a snake pit at that point. But Dad didn't seem concerned. One trip when I was a teenager got strange real quick. My friends and I were all piled into my dad's 4x4, and we were driving through the bush to Spike's so Dad could tell us scary Spike stories and freak us out. We drove onto the property and something immediately caught my eye. Up on the hill opposite Spike's hut, there was what appeared to be a cowboy slumped against a log, hat over his face taking a nap. Something about his body position looked unnatural and uncomfortable. It wasn't the way you'd be sat if you were taking a casual nap in the middle of a workday. And even if it was, there was no reason for anyone to be out there. The farm was long defunct, and there was no forest business to be taken care of on that property. I pointed it out to my dad, and instead of letting us out of the car at Spike's, as he usually did, he said he wanted to keep driving through the farm to show us something. He maintained that it was nothing, but that if the figure was still there when we came back through, we'd stop and check it out. Of course, whatever he wanted to show us seemed totally made up as he drove us through that forest. And when we came back, I spotted the slumped over cowboy again, never having moved an inch, still in that same unnatural position. I yelled out to Dad to stop, reminding him of his promise, but instead, he acted like he couldn't hear me, locked the truck doors, and drove off the farm much faster than he'd ever drove on those dirt forest roads. My friends and I all looked at each other in confusion, but we all knew, when it came to this area, questioning my dad was futile at best, dangerous at worst. Dad denied that any of the events of that day ever happened after that, but my friends and I were still curious about what was going on out there. So a few months later, we went camping on our own and set out to find Spike's hut. It took hours of driving through the forest to find the gate, but eventually we found it without my dad's help. Something was off once we got there, more so than usual that day. My mates jumped out of the car but were suddenly frozen, not wanting to walk any closer to that hut, for no visible reason. Vibe was just wrong that day, and it felt like we'd walked into something that didn't belong to us. The tug in my gut to get out was so strong. I'd spent 2 hours finding the place. I was going to explore it, goddammit. One of my friends acted brave and walked from the car to the hut with me, quietly acknowledging more and more the signs of inhabitants, with knowing nods between us. We said nothing to the others, but we were on high alert. Felt like someone could be back at any minute, or that they never left and were watching us as we poked around the debris. We walked up to the side of the hut to find a small shed with 3 walls. I heard my friend's voice go squeaky as he called me over to look inside. On the ground was a huge pile of ashes from what looked like a cooking fire, and confirmed this was the presence of a giant makeshift grill made from cross-hashed wire, sitting over the fire and hinged to the shed wall. As I'm looking at this setup, I figure that whoever has been here has been hunting and cooking large chunks of their kill over that fire. Pretty clever, actually. But then, my stomach dropped. As my eyes traveled down the grill to the ground, I saw a baby's sock. Tiny, pink, and terribly out of place. Then another, then a shirt, then a ribbon from a child's hair, all sitting right beside the ashes onto the ground, next to a woman's weekly Christmas cookbook. That's when alarm bells in my head went off, and I rounded up my mates to GTFO. Some ranger or crazy old bushy hanging out of the trashed hut was one thing. That there was absolutely no reason for a baby to be out there. There's no way anything good had come of a child's clothing right by a huge fire and grill. When we got back to the campground, we couldn't shake the rotten feeling of being watched. All of us were so unsettled that we packed up our shit and decided not to stay the night. When I got home, I told my dad about it. He shook it off, saying, "Weird stuff happens out there." Being young and dumb, I never thought to look up missing persons in the area and make an attempt to either explain the cowboy or those kids' clothes. But I can tell you, I will never make the mistake of going out to Spike's hut without my father, ever again.